Hey everybody, welcome back to the Live Ultralight podcast. Today we have a very special episode, one of your guys' the crowd's favorites, which is a deep dive on a new product. So obviously we've got the man Brigham here, who helps us design all the products here, gets them out to you guys and every detail looked at. So we'll be diving deep into a new product, which we're very excited for, and is also a product that you guys have been asking for since the release of its, we'll call it brother or sister product. So it'll be really exciting. But for those of you that are brand new to the podcast, on the Live Ultralight podcast, it is powered by Outdoor Vitals, and we typically spend our time inspiring you to get outdoors, showing you how to lighten your pack and build your confidence so that you can start living a life full of adventure. So if you're interested in getting out more, adventuring more, make sure you are subscribed to this. And for those of you who have not yet done so, please go leave a review. It helps this podcast get found and helps us help more people get out and start adventuring. So Brigham, what is this magical product we're going to be talking about today? Because I know that's how we refer to it internally, as magical
product. Yeah. Yep. It's the Vario Jacket.
What is the Vario Jacket? Where did it come from? Where did the idea come from? Because we needed another jacket, right?
Came from need more jackets.
This is if depending on where you categorize the Ventus, this would be like our third or fourth insulated piece now. So
I think what it is kind of cool because I do feel like it came from a few different directions, which is often, I don't know, I sometimes feel like it's beating a dead horse because we kind of say the same things like a lot. Like that's just oftentimes where some of these originate, is like we kind of say the same thing. It came from like a bunch of different directions, but it's just the case.
It comes from build time, really.
We get
that's where all the directions come from. I feel like
and then maybe it's just that once we get it from enough different things or areas or directions, like then we feel like, oh yeah, we should do something about this. But that's probably a good way to originate a product.
Yeah,
that it's not just like from one suggestion or one audience or one bit of feedback, but it's corroborated by, maybe some people's feedback and some suggestions, but our own field experience and some of our own thoughts. And then, it's probably a good way to
I think from my perspective, it was, first off, the second that we released the Ventus hoodie, people were asking, hey, could we get this in a full zip and could we get pockets, right? Those are the two big asked for features. And the answer was no, because that's not what that piece was intended for. And so then when we kind of played that farther forward, the answer was still no, as we even got more pushback from you guys saying, hey, you guys really should do this in a full zip and hand pockets. And I think the answer was for us, it's just no, that takes away from the Ventus, meaning the Ventus is so unique because of its weight category, its use, its features. It's not meant to be a jacket. It's meant to be this hoodie piece. And so we kind of played at that. And then it was kind of, as we played at that more, it's like, well, if we are going to look at this seriously, it needs to be a whole new piece with differences.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking of it because, in terms of getting that feedback from people regarding that piece, the Ventus hoodie, by adding a full zip and pockets, it changes the product. That's how deliberate we were about making the Ventus how we did. That's the product. Just like think of it as like a 2-door coupe versus a sedan. Like you go to 2 doors to 4 doors, you're talking a different car. Yeah. I guess how that evolved is, like you said, if we're going to do that, then it's a different product. And so if it's a different product, then that allows us to have kind of a different objective, some different goals, some different performance standards and things like that. So here we're getting into some of those different directions of where this piece originated. Yeah,
and so I think that was kind of the original thought. But then I would add to this from my personal perspective, where this piece came into be was everyone in the office started to use it almost as a replacement for a puffy, meaning the Ventus is almost as warm as what was then when we released it, the Lofttech jacket. This is before the Novas were released. And so we're all using it and we're saying, this thing almost feels as warm as a Lofttech jacket. I may as well just take the Ventus.
Yeah.
But then if you are using only the Ventus, sometimes you want some additional features or want a hair more warmth.
Yeah.
And so it kind of adapted to be like, well, like that was kind of the need was like, can you get away with just bringing a Ventus or do you need something warmer? And if you needed something warmer, then do you leave the Ventus behind? Because, I mean, for me personally, like, depending on the weather conditions, I sleep in the Ventus a lot. It's such a good complement to a top quilt to sleep in a Ventus and then not have to bring a hood or a balaclava or whatever. Like, sleep in the Ventus, pull up the hood when it's cold, and it's such a good piece for that. Anyway, so I think all of that being put into play, it was like, okay, maybe there is still a piece missing in our lineup here, and that would be the piece that we designed. Yeah,
I would definitely second everything you just said. And then as we're kind of putting all these things together, I think another aspect of it is just that realizing, we can't expect that everybody, like we're designing gear kind of, I would say, towards a more narrow audience in like, the backpacking and ultralight backpacking space. But it's important to also realize that, there may be people that just aren't necessarily in need of or wanting like kind of what you could call your like traditional style puffy jacket. Like there's just people that maybe they don't want to use down. They don't want to use like a natural insulation like that. They may not like how it looks, and that's not necessarily always a priority of like aesthetic for us, but it is important that we do acknowledge that like, hey, right now we offer down puffy jackets, but there could be a huge chunk of like our audience, the guys out there backpacking that just don't really care for the down puffy. And so
I think that's got to be a conversation that I want to have later in this podcast is basically this piece, the Vario Jacket, compared to your traditional down puffy jacket, not necessarily like a really warmed one or
just like three
basically like our Lofttech jacket or the Nova UL style of jacket.
Yeah.
I think for the listeners, you guys will get a lot of value out of us just comparing those because there are some differences. Some friends of ours even that make content have talked pretty specifically on this. I think there's a lot of interesting points to make. So I think it'll help us differentiate why this piece exists and which piece you may want to select if you're selecting a piece.
That'll definitely be a good topic to go over in a little while.
Yeah.
Why this piece versus others and what this piece, offers versus something else. I guess one thing we could do real quick that you did ask earlier, and I don't know that I really answered too well, is like what are we talking about? What is the Vario Jacket? Well, the Vario Jacket is a synthetic insulation. I would call it like a 3-season jacket. It's an outer piece. It's an outer layer to be your insulating jacket for pretty much 3-season use. It's a full zip hooded jacket that, because of the insulation, it being a synthetic sheeted insulation, it doesn't require any additional stitch lines or quilting to stabilize insulation. And then it also has, some targeted ventilation in the underarm, and then,
Yeah, I think for those of you that are listening to this on YouTube, you'll be able to see a model or a jacket. This is actually a women's cut here on the screen. If you're listening to this on your phone or wherever, you should be able to pull this up on our website and look at the things that we're talking about in specific. This will be released the week that this podcast is coming out, so you'll likely be hearing this at the same time that we've released this product. But yeah, it's a synthetic piece. For those of you that are familiar with the Ventus, it uses the same 3DFX insulation. We were able to migrate this over to a 50% recycled insulation, so there's no loss in performance. We just were able to source 50% of that insulation from recycled sources. And so I hate to do this, but it is one of the better ways to describe this piece to our existing audience, which is basically to point out the differences in this to the Ventus. So the Ventus is an extremely popular piece of ours. It's one of our best sellers. And a lot of you guys have that piece. So again, just to point out the differences in this, you've now got that full zip. You've now got these hand pockets, which these are a recessed pocket, which helps with warmth as well. We added, or we kept the vent underneath the arm, but we actually shrunk the size of it. So again, and that will play into the fact that this is built to be a slightly warmer piece. So it still has the underarm perforated vents here. And then the insulation itself, it is the same insulation, but it's a slightly thicker or more weighty category. So instead of being a 25 GSM or gram per square meter fabric, it's now a 40. So slightly warmer piece there. Other aspects of that are going to be pretty much the same as the Ventus. You still have the draw cord on the bottom. Yep. The hood's going to fit and act the same. The fabrics are the same. Internal and external fabrics are going to be the same. And then this will be available in a stellar blue, a cherry mahogany, which is what I've got in my hand right now, and the black color. So that is the piece.
Yeah, and then also just like the Ventus, there's a men's and a women's cut.
Yep. Thumb hole loops, YKK, zippers. There's, very, very, very similar pieces there. And really what that all equates to is the Ventus hoodie is somewhere around the 6.5 to 7 ounce weight category for it. Whereas this piece right here comes in at about the 9.5 to 10 ounce weight category. So roughly 3 ounces heavier than the Ventus hoodie with that zipper, the hand pockets, warmer insulation, etc. Yeah. There's also going to be a slightly difference in packability. This one is designed, I believe, to just pack into its own pocket. It doesn't have the internal chest pocket, if I remember right. We took that off.
No, yeah, there's no internal chest pocket. And then, it's slightly thicker insulation, so it's warmer. And I guess one other thing to note is because this is intended to be an outer insulation piece, it is slightly roomier than the Ventus. So if you're familiar with the Ventus, this will allow for more layering underneath it. If you're not familiar with the Ventus, then just think of this as it's a 3-season, outer insulation jacket with room for like a mid layer and a base layer underneath. I would say, I think most people that have used it, tried it on, provided feedback is that I would say that the fit or the cut is still quite trim and it's efficient. There's not a lot of excess bagginess or stuff that's going to catch a lot of wind in exposed areas. So it still has a really good I don't know if you'd call it athletic or trim aesthetic to how it fits. So
yeah, and to take this maybe just one step further, we do use a 20 denier ripstop nylon as our internal and exterior fabric.
Yep.
Maybe elaborate on why because if you look across our jacket line, almost everything is 20 denier. From our actual rain jacket exterior fabric to our Nova line to the Ventus. Why?
We have found a really good balance, what we feel, and a lot of people have given us the positive feedback on that, is we found a good balance with weight and durability of a 20D ripstop nylon. Nylon is a inherently strong synthetic fiber, and then that 20D weight class of the thickness of the fabric and the fibers that it's made of. I think it's a good balance between allowing us to design carefully a jacket that hits our weight objectives, but still meets our durability objectives. So
I want to ask this. So let's say we want the durability of the 20 denier on the outside of the piece. Would there be any benefits to having a 15 or 10 denier on the inside, or are there trade-offs there too? You know what I mean?
I'd say the only benefit would be that it would weigh a tiny bit less. It would be
any additional coatings. Would there be any additional coatings required when you're going to that? Or
it's just going to be
breathability increase at all?
Breathability would possibly increase, I would say probably negligibly.
Yeah.
But and the inside of a jacket, durability is less of a concern, but it still would reduce the durability of the overall piece by using a thinner, lighter fabric on the inside. So,
yeah, I think part of that question in my mind is coming from sometimes using down products. And sometimes when you get into those light of tiers, it seems like you have to add extra coatings to make them downproof still and like almost overcoat them to where you might drop from 20 denier to 10 denier, but it seems like with the extra coatings required at 10 denier at times, or depending on mill or all these different variables, sometimes you're not really losing that much weight by dropping the durability.
Yeah, and like coatings aren't the only way for downproofing fabric. There's other manufacturing processes that downproof a fabric, but they also decrease the breathability. So in the end, I just think it's a good balance of durability and weight, and it works well.
Yeah, I think it does work extremely well. Speaking of that, let's talk maybe a little bit now that they know what the piece is. They kind of know why we built it. Let's talk a little bit about just usability and when someone would maybe want to use it versus other pieces. So for the sake of this podcast, where I would say let's talk in terms of Ventus and Nova UL on our pieces. I guess we could reference like the Lofttech jacket from historic times, but and then we also could compare that straight across to a Ghost Whisperer or something like that.
Yeah, like
too.
More of a general the category of a down puffy jacket, sure.
And when we would use this versus others, so it actually is a tough question, I would say, because each one has pros and cons to it. So starting off, I would say with the Ventus is just the lightest weight insulated piece that we offer, and really in the world per se, in the sense of if you need something just to have that extra warmth, to be an insulated, basically what I mean by insulators, I mean like a layer of fabric, an insulation, and then another layer of fabric. So I put the Ventus in a different category in my mind than some of these like grid fleeces or anything like that.
Yeah, it's a different insulation type for sure.
Yeah. So when it comes to me just needing like an insulated piece, the Ventus is the lightest weight option. And so I typically want the Ventus when I'm either in super summer conditions where I know it's really not going to get cold at night, but I still want to have a jacket, whether that's for safety or just used in the evenings, or when I'm using it in a layering system where I'm going to take the Ventus to wear a lot because it regulates temperature so well. But then I'm going to put on like a down puffy at some point when it gets really cold in the evenings and so on and so forth. That's how I typically am using the Ventus. The Vario falls into a slightly different category where I feel very comfortable, even in a lot of 3-season scenarios, to just take the Vario and maybe not the Ventus on this particular trip or something like that. Like I can, it's warmer than the Ventus, and it gives me a slightly broader range of overall use, I would say, before I need to bring a second jacket or a second layering insulated piece. So when we did the Uinta Highline this year, we're going into high elevation scenarios where weather can swing drastically and swing very quickly. And so I think the first time we did it, I took a Ventus and a Nova UL. This time I opted to just take the Vario jacket. And that worked really well for me because it still shares so much of that DNA with the Ventus of really good breathability, really good temperature regulation. But when I'm sitting stagnant, it's just going to be a hair warmer than the Ventus.
Well, I mean, I would want to clarify that I wouldn't say it's a hair warmer. It's substantially warmer than the Ventus, in so much that in cold conditions, I'm not going to want to sit still in a Ventus for more than a couple minutes versus like the Vario jacket. It for sure would qualify as like a static insulation for, you're sitting around camp, you're low activity, you're not really generating a lot of heat, but in, cool and colder temperatures, like it's a legitimate insulating piece. I would never do that in a Ventus. And then, to your comments about the Highline Trail, like, that's some of that field experience, like product inspiration that we get is like not this summer, but the summer before when we did the Highline Trail, it was incredibly wet, and just like the bad wet, where it's like cold and wet, and then it's going between, you know, rain and hail and rain and sleet and back to rain. And, you know, that's the type of water that just seems to just stick, you know, just, it just doesn't dry. And then the air is just constantly just soggy and humid. And so, you know, you, like you said, you took a Ventus and a Nova UL, which is a mostly down insulated piece, and I just took the Nova UL. But you know, kind of when I think we had probably already started development on the Vario Jacket at that point. So kind of knowing that was coming, this year when we did the UNO Highline Trail, I for sure knew that like that's the piece I wanted to take, because I guess that's another thing that we haven't talked too much about yet on this podcast is this is a fully synthetic, 100% synthetic insulation, which means it's virtually unaffected by moisture in terms of its ability to retain your body heat. So it can get, like if you get caught out in the rain and you're wearing a backpack or whatever, like it's still going to retain your body heat because the insulation is able to, it doesn't absorb water and it's able to maintain its loft when it's wet. So that's, you know, a huge peace of mind type thing for an environment like a really wet weather system in the UNO Highline or the Pacific Northwest. I think that's a really compelling reason for one to consider, you know, the Vario Jacket as their primary insulation piece. If people just find themselves spending most of their time in more rain-heavy environments, it's a really good option for that.
So I'm going to muddy the waters just a little bit more and bring in the Nova UL to make this even more clear for you guys, which is the Nova UL is a down insulated piece, but we use down LT in it, which means we've blended a little bit of synthetic in with it to give it that added moisture benefits, meaning not only does it have hyper dry down in it, which is a wax-based DWR coating, but it also has a little bit of synthetic in there in case worst case scenario happened and it did get totally saturated. It won't completely collapse. It'll retain some loft and be able to dry out. But on top of that, what's actually been almost more substantial in the field after using it for longer periods of time and getting feedback is the stitchless fabric of the Nova line repels so much water. So I was actually just with my mom the other day, and her and my dad like to go jeeping a lot. And they were out in Colorado. They were jeeping with their friends, and they got to a section that's really, really bad. I think it's called the Deadliest Trail or something like that. When my mom gets nervous, she gets out of the Jeep and she walks. So she's walking for 45 minutes outside the Jeep in tons of water. And, you know, she's telling me this story because she wants to get to the ending of the story. And I'm like, well, did you get wet? She's like, no. I'm like, did it come through your jacket? Yeah. No. Yeah. You know what I mean? So she's out there in 45 minutes in a down jacket, not getting wet at all. But what she wanted to tell me is she was so nervous she didn't even put the hood on the jacket, put the hood up. So her friend was like, you know, that jacket's really nice, but don't you wish it had a hood? And she's like, oh, it has a hood. She takes the hood, she flips it up, and just slams the back of her head with a puddle of water. Yeah. But that's what's interesting about the Nova is that stitchless fabric and whatnot. It does so well in moisture. So I want to stipulate this a little bit more. What I would separate, what makes the Vario different than a Nova UL or a Nova Pro is breathability. So the Nova line with that stitchless fabric, I mean, it like blocks the wind really, really well. It's also got that extra loft and things like that. So it's going to be a warmer piece, but it's also going to be a piece that's not going to breathe. Yes, it has pit zips. Those do help tremendously, but it's still not going to be a piece that you're just going to want to like crank out miles in, even at a low exertion pace. Versus the Vario, because of its synthetic fabrics, because of the fabrics we can use with less coatings and treatments for down, things like that, and the underarm vents that it has, it works very well. It walks this fine line of being a static piece and an active piece, whereas I would classify our Novas as static pieces.
Yeah. So
Static meaning you're not moving.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty accurate. I would agree with that for the most part. Like, me personally, I'm not going to hike in the Vario Jacket. It's just too warm. Like it's a warm jacket. But you're absolutely right in that because of the insulation type, it's a continuous filament insulation. So it's a synthetic insulation that's manufactured into sheets, but each little fiber is a continuous miles long fiber, and there's millions of those in the insulation. And so there's no such thing as like insulation migration. Fibers aren't, working their way through the fabric. So that allows us to use a fabric on the inside that doesn't have to be downproof, and the outside too. Like we don't have to use, a fabric that would be classified as downproof, which makes it much more breathable, like for sure. And that's a really good point is like and you can feel it too when you put it on. Like if you're just wearing a t-shirt, you definitely feel that softness of the fabric. There's like a very notorious feeling for downproof fabric. I don't think anybody would ever make the statement that it ever feels soft against the skin.
They don't call it cotton.
It might not feel sticky, but it's not going to feel like soft against the skin. Whereas this fabric, it does. It feels very soft against the skin, and that is because we're able to use a different type of fabric that's not doesn't need to be downproof. It is soft against the skin, and it is much more breathable. So that's a very valid point.
Yeah, so I guess to sum up part of that conversation again, it would be Ventus works well as an active piece. I wouldn't say high exertion unless you're in really cold environments, but moderate exertion, active. Vario is kind of the same, like low to moderate exertion. It still works well. Also works well as a static piece. Then you get into the Nova line, and those are, for the most part, what I'd call static pieces. Now, keep in mind that like walking in and out of the office or like I'm not calling those as active. They're very small snippets of activity. So like obviously, I mean, in the winter months, like heck, I go to the Nova Pro to go in and out of the office just because you're out in the cold for a brief second, then you're back in a warm vehicle or back in a warm office. Yes, I am walking, or I'm walking in a restaurant or walking out of a restaurant, but generally speaking, those two, the Novas I would classify as static, whereas these are Vario walks that line of static and active. Yeah. Now, you bring up a good point, though, with talking about continuous fiber insulation. I think that's something that's worth talking about just briefly, too. So in the world of sheeted insulations, which is basically all synthetic insulations, except for if it's something like the Loft-Tech where it's categorized as a loose fill or it's trying to imitate down, most of them come out in sheets. So big, wide, white-looking batting type sheets. And with those, a lot of fibers can be what are called staple fibers or shortened fibers that are then just kind of glued and bonded together to make that sheet. Mm-hmm. Or you can have what's called a continuous fiber insulation, which, like Brigham said, can be miles long per se of this fiber weaving and weaving and weaving. So walk our listeners through, Brigham, what the benefit is of a continuous fiber versus something else. And for those that are also familiar with other brands and stuff out there, probably one of the more known continuous fiber insulations out there would be the Apex ClimaShield or what's it called?
Yeah, ClimaShield Apex.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's probably, and that's going to be a more popular insulation out there that is continuous fiber. I would think that when in terms of, when people talk about something like Primaloft, they've got so many categories and stuff, they're going to have both types. So you'd have to look at specifics for a company like that, I would think, to know if it's a staple or a continuous fiber insulation. Yeah. But what are the benefits of a continuous fiber insulation?
So one of them is the one we just already mentioned. You don't get the, like migration. You don't get fibers working their way out of a
like when you look at the back of this jacket, that's a very large panel with no sewing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So that's kind of the next benefit is it doesn't. So because think of this as from here to here, there's just millions of these fibers that are just kind of like not woven, but they're randomly just placed so that it creates a bunch of little air pockets and it creates this lofty sheet of insulation. But the advantage of continuous fiber insulation is that doesn't shift around and move. It basically maintains the same thickness in every square inch of this little sheet of insulation. So the insulation, the warmth is the same throughout the jacket. And because it all stays put and maintains its loft everywhere equally, you don't have to do these stitch lines to keep the insulation in place.
And a stitch line is going to be an opportunity for snagging, wind to get in, water to get in, etc.
And dirt to get in.
And dirt to get in.
Yeah, so it's very stable. The other advantage, kind of alluded to it already, is like you don't get cold spots because there's no opportunity for any down voids or insulation voids. So you get, it's an easy way of thinking it is continuous filament means continuous thickness insulation. Like you're going to have consistent thickness of insulation throughout every single panel on the jacket. So,
but what about, I think that another side benefit is just overall durability. So washing it over and over or using it over and over. If you've got a staple, length type insulation, the adhesive could pull or stretch over time.
There's almost a lifespan for how long that's going to hold together. Whereas this insulation, it's basically infinite. You're taking 5 miles of fiber and you're just cutting like let's just say a 2 foot chunk of that out that's not going to go anywhere. And so, I'd say there's just not that potential possibility for it to start becoming separated like a staple sheeted insulation would. It
comes out more stable to begin with, and it stays more stable over time, washing it, using it, etc. It's just got more durability. And then, like I say, the lack of stitching just means more warmth, essentially. It also makes it look really good, in my opinion.
And more durable on the outside. So, kind of like we talked about when we launched or released the Nova jackets having the stitchless technology, like that's a durability benefit for the end users. There's not exposed thread all over the jacket. So, and those are they have the potential to get snagged, caught, and cut. So,
yeah. And then not to mention one thing that we skipped over is the fact that this insulation, this particular style of continuous fiber insulation is a stretching insulation.
Yeah, so the 3DFX family of insulation, they call it, so Torre is our partner that manufactures the insulation. They make 3DFX insulation, and they call it 3DFX active insulation. And so it's a stretching insulation. And how that does that is all those fibers we're talking about, there's two things that take place. The fibers are all varying thicknesses, which creates an inconsistency and a randomness as all these fibers are kind of laid on top of each other. So because they're all different thicknesses, it creates all these little voids in between them. But then they also coil and kind of, I wouldn't say crimp, but coil all these fibers at a random shape as well. So there's probably not two identical coil profiles of fiber in that entire jacket. And so because they're different thicknesses and different coil shapes and intervals, that creates even more pockets, but that allows the insulation to stretch because it's almost like, think of one slinky, that's like one fiber. And so that slinky, it's coiled up and it can pull and stretch. And so what that does with a sheeted insulation is when you bend an elbow or reach up or down or bend forward, the insulation is able to stretch with your body but also maintain loft. But also while it's stretching, it still allows air to move and breathe through it because it maintains that loft. It's not compressing and sealing off all those pockets of insulation. So,
yeah. It makes for a more comfortable piece. It makes for better temperature regulation. It's really an exceptional insulation that I have a pretty long history of using. And so I want to pivot this for a second now into just like what would be some additional pros of let's just compare this to let's say it's a ghost whisper, right? Let's just take like probably the most common, popular down jacket in a similar warmth category to this, which I would say is probably the Ghost Whisperer, what would be pros and cons of, say, a Vario with synthetic insulation versus a down piece like the Ghost Whisperer? And I mean, I know personally for myself, over time, I've gone, I want to say back, but kind of like back, because I did have a synthetic piece that was very, very similar in weight category to this piece years ago from Toray that I loved. And then I kind of went to a down piece, and then I've kind of come back to this piece. And so, yeah, like what are your just thoughts on why this is such a great piece and how it would compete with something like a Ghost Whisperer?
Yeah, I think it lends itself to a little bit more active use. And again, I just said a few minutes ago, like, I'm not going to be like really hiking in this, but it has more allowance, I would say, or more tolerance for active use, because we're not having to use downproof fabrics, and we're using a more durable fabric, which means that less durable Superlight 10D fabric has to be ultra processed for downproofness, which means it's just going to be even less breathable. This is going to feel more comfortable against the skin. It's going to be a much more durable piece. Again, more durable fabric inside and out, more breathable, but also no stitching, like no stitched insulation lines. And it's just going to, I was telling Joe this the other day, our videographer, that it's almost just like you're able to be a bit more careless with the piece. I don't advocate carelessness, but it's.
I don't know if that word just came out of your mouth, because you're like the most careful guy I know.
Yeah, that's probably true. But you know what I mean? Like, you don't have to. It's more of a worry-free, if you want to put it that way.
That was a thought that came to my mind in the sense of, so I've got like infinite jackets in my house. Like, I need to purge the amount of jackets in my house really bad, because I get samples after samples after samples, and then we get the production ones in, and I'll typically take a production one, and I've got a lot of jackets. And so it's interesting to see what I grab when I'm headed out. And what I have found is that I've been grabbing this piece for a massively broad spectrum of use.
Yeah.
And I think there's a few reasons for that. One, depending on what I'm doing, like if I'm going backpacking, that's different. But if I'm like in the broad spectrum of day-to-day life and other active living, I typically grab this for the full zip over the Ventus, just because it's convenient for that type of application. Yeah. Two, compared to some of the down pieces, let's say I'm going to go hang out with my kids and ride a mountain bike. Or let's say I'm going to go hop, in our UTV and go for a ride or something with my kids. And well, what happens out there? There's dust, there's debris, there's all these things. Well, this cleans up so much easier. I can wash it with a load of laundry as long as it's a delicate load, and I don't put in a ton of, detergent type of thing. Like, it's easier to wash. Yeah. I don't have special care instructions like with the down piece and things like that. And so what it just makes for, like, this word that comes to mind with this piece is just versatile. It's just it's really, really versatile. It's kind of like your best your if jackets were friends, it'd be like your best friend, because you can use it in such a broad spectrum of applications, and it works really well. Like, it vents well, but it also is quite warm for sitting still. And so for me, I have been grabbing this jacket for months and months now. Yep. I think primarily for those reasons. Now, if I'm doing like a very specific hike, I might take a Ventus and a Nova UL. I might take these different specific pieces, but for the broad spectrum of use, I've been grabbing this jacket a ton.
I think that's a really good way to look at it. Is it has a very broad use case that you can almost eliminate thought process out of it, because for the most part, most of the times, like if in a scenario where you would like think about, well, should I take this or that jacket? Like, you can almost just do away with that thought process, because most of the time this will work. It'll handle whatever like use case in a very broad spectrum that you're looking at. So kind of, again, like some of that like thoughtlessness, it's like really easy it's just going to work for so many different use cases or environments. Like I used it like for all of last year as a daily jacket, but it's one where, like, say we were coming into the office early one morning and it was a work trip day, like a backpacking trip day, and I drove into work in January wearing this jacket, but I happen to, let's just say I was going to take a different jacket on the trip, but I forgot to pack it. I'd be totally confident just taking the jacket that I drove into work with straight to the mountains in January. You know what I mean? So
yeah, it's kind of hard to explain in that sense, but I think it will become a lot of our listeners' favorite pieces as well. And this is probably a good time to just add in here too that supply chain wise and ordering wise, and just from our perspective as a company, we only have one batch of these, coming in right now. So for those of you listening, you're our diehards. I would highly suggest that you look at getting one of these, because most likely by the time we could get another production of these, it'll be after the winter season.
Yeah, I was just thinking, there's this. You'll get the point in a second, but you know how it's like September now, and you just start seeing like pumpkin everything everywhere.
Right.
So there's this storage unit out by my house that has really funny marquee signs, and they just said like pumpkin spice storage units are in stock now or something. Like they're pretty cheeky. They're funny, but like
should have called this the pumpkin spice color right here.
To the point where it's like your point about we have one batch that's what we have when we launch this. And to the people that really, like, if somebody's, they're listening to this, they do the research and they're like, yeah, that's the jacket. I want that jacket, or I want that jacket for me and somebody else. Definitely do a Tayson saying, get it sooner than later. Like if you're thinking Christmas, get it the week we launch it. Don't try to wait till Black Friday, because I don't know that they'll be here. That Seriously. Sort of thing. It's just so.
Well, to put it in perspective too, like this is a smaller batch than most of our Ventus POs, and our Ventus POs, like we're stacking these on top of each other. But where this is a brand new piece, we're taking a little bit more of a conservative approach with it. But from everything we can see and hear, it's going to be an extremely popular piece, and it's not going to be worth waiting, because I can guarantee we will have stockouts on it. And that's just the way we've done things with COVID. It just happened to change some of the things where we want to make sure that we'd rather have stockouts than excess inventory, if that makes sense. Yeah. And so we didn't stack a PO on this one, which means by the end of, I don't know when, but when we sell through these, there's going to be a delayed stockout on these. So
yeah, and just like maybe a little bit of transparency here, pretty much everybody is always going to say when they release a product, like, everybody's going to love this, buy it quick before it sells out. And when Tayson says, from everything what we've seen and heard, people are really going to like this, the behind the scenes is that we do like preliminary or advanced surveying, basically, where we take a pulse by certain methods, where we basically release this to people and collect their purchasing intent. So that's not just like a sales tactic of, oh, this is awesome, better hurry and order. Like it's legitimate, and like I think people understand too the supply chain situation. It is a bit of a limitation right now, and yeah, like you said, it's not as big of a batch that we typically order with some other pieces. So we're really just trying to help people out with, if you do want this and you're pumped about it. We are trying to be transparent and throw you a bone and say, like, yeah, get it quicker than slower.
Well, what we messed up, I say messed up, but what happened with this particular PO2 is that we said, all right, let's order kind of like a minimum run, full on planning to order a second minimum run. And then we had a couple scenarios where we got overstocked on a few items that were brand new products. And so then we kind of made it a rough guideline here that we don't stack POs on brand new product lines, which means not only did we launch with like what we normally would launch with, we launched with a smaller amount of those, and then we planning on doing a follow-up PO, and we haven't put that follow-up PO in. So if we have really strong sales right out of the gate, we absolutely will. But keep in mind that could be 6 to 8 months before we get the next run of them. So, so there's your bone for those of you guys that are listening, diehards. Order early. And you'll be much happier than when your size or color is out of stock. But just to go back to just that conversation, I would say, of just versatility, some of the benefits I think of synthetic is it's just a little bit more carefree. You get some water on it, you're not as worried. You sweat in it, you're not as worried. it starts to get dirt or things on it, it's easier to wash, and it just becomes a very versatile piece. And then I would say like sometimes there's times when I might be sitting in it as a static piece where I'm like, man, I wish this was just a little bit warmer for a static piece. But typically I can always throw on a rain jacket over the top. That helps a bit. Or like you get up and move just a little bit and you'll heat up and be very comfortable in it. And so like we've mentioned, it's been a very broad used application as far as temperature ranges for me. And so it's just been an easy jacket to grab for what that's worth. Is I've been grabbing of my pool of jackets on the wall. It seems to have been the most common jacket I would say over the last 8 months and maybe longer since we've been doing the testing on it. So
carefree and easy to use is a good way to think of it. And I guess I just remembered this when you were talking about washing it. Another really, it's very impressive how quickly this thing dries and how little it even gets wet when you wash it.
Yeah.
Like
you pull it out of the washing machine, you're like, what?
Follow the care instructions on the labels, but I don't have a front-loading washing machine. It's nothing special. And like, so it's taking a beating in that spinning cycle, Oh,
jeez.
But like when I take it out of the wash, like it's hardly wet, so it dries really, really quickly. So that's another benefit of the 100% synthetic nature of the jacket is like it's hard to get wet. It just doesn't really get wet when you try to get it wet, and it dries really quickly. So more on that kind of like carefree aspect of it is that, and then for the we try to mix up like a lot of our backpacking trip styles and things, but we often do end up cramming a lot of miles in just so we can cover a lot of ground and see a lot of things on our trips. And so, a lot of the ultralight backpackers out there, they're spending most of the day on the move. They're not necessarily sitting around a campfire for hours on end every day. So that's a little bit different. That creates a different set of objectives for an insulating jacket versus, just a jacket that you never want to possibly be cold in sitting still for hours. You know what I mean? So like when you said, sometimes if you're sitting still for a really long time, you may feel like, oh, this could be a little bit warmer. But for the backpacker, that scenario almost just doesn't even exist, because you're hiking most of the day and then you set up camp, you eat dinner, and you go to bed. So, and for that, I mean, it's more than adequate in most conditions. So
yeah. I think sometimes we probably should be wrapping this up instead of this, but I think I've spent so much time in cold temperatures that like there's this idea of like some level of discomfort is normal. Okay. And I think we see this when we take new people out backpacking, such as Dan Becker, when we brought him out. Emmett is his videographer, and Emmett's a stud. He's been sleeping in a tent for a while now on these trips with Dan, and Dan is doing everything he can to make him comfortable sleeping in the tent. And after he slept on with some of our gear and stuff, and I asked him the next morning, I said, how did you sleep? And he's like, I slept pretty good, this. But it was like, as he kind of described it, I said, well, that sounds like a pretty good night of sleep backpacking, right? And I was like, if you're expecting to like go in and like fall asleep for 8 hours straight without ever rolling over on an air inflated pad and in a sleeping bag, you know what I mean? Like, then you've got the wrong perception to begin with, if that makes sense. So like there's, again, like some discomfort is kind of the norm when it comes to just being outdoors, right?
Yeah.
And so I think why I've gravitated so much towards this is even in extremely cold environments, it takes such a level of like the edge of cold off of me that I'm willing to use it in probably colder conditions than than other people might, and so on and so forth. And so it's like that's how I think it gets such a broad spectrum of use for me. Is I'm okay being a little bit cold. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that to me is normal to be a little bit cold, and to extend this thing down to much colder temperatures than maybe someone else might. And so that's where like, man, this thing, I have had this piece in conditions that that really just like you think about it, like dead of winter type conditions and
sub-freezing.
up on top of the mountain,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? And just this massive array of variety because it takes such a good edge off of the cold, but then it also does such a good job at regulating temperatures with the breathability and the synthetic nature and the pit zips and stuff. So to me, it's just a very, very usable piece in such a wide variety. It's a little bit more convenient to use than the Ventus because of the zips and the pockets. It is still a totally different piece than the Ventus, and you will still see us use the Ventus a ton. You know what I mean? It's just different applications. This one slides right in between the Ventus and the Nova UL in our lineup. And offers you guys just one more option, one more tool in the toolbox that I think you guys will really, really enjoy. It's like the workhorse of jackets, I guess, in our lineup, I would almost say.
Yeah. And
I think you guys are going to love it. So any last remarks on the Vario that we haven't covered or that you just want to know?
I think we gave it a good talk.
I think we did too. Hopefully that is helpful to you guys. I'm sure even if you don't end up buying one of these, you learned about insulations today, active static versus static pieces, other things like that. We hope you got value in this. Again, that's really the biggest reason that we do the podcast is to help you guys, build more confidence, build more knowledge, and to empower you guys to get out there on more adventures. So thanks for tuning in. If you've not yet left us a review, please go and leave us a review. It helps us get ranked, it helps us get found, helps us help more people get out on trail. And if you do have any questions that you want to write in, you can always drop them on the comments section of our YouTube channel, where we'll be able to answer them on the Live Ultralight YouTube channel. Or you can email us at liveultralightpodcast@gmail.com. We'll also field the questions there and answer those on the podcast too. So been thinking a little bit about doing some more like Q&A style podcasts. So if that's something you guys are interested in, let us know. That could be something that we do more regularly. But again, thanks for listening. Make sure you're subscribed, and we'll catch you on the next episode.